Imagine the coldest night of the year. The wind's howling like a banshee. Snow is piling up against your door 3 feet deep, and you are hungry, not just peckish, not just ready for lunch, but genuinely, desperately hungry. That deep, gnawing ache in the pit of your stomach that makes your hands shake and your vision blur. Your fridge is empty, the power's been out for days, and the nearest supermarket might as well be on Mars. For a medieval peasant, this wasn't some apocalyptic nightmare from a disaster movie. This was just another Tuesday in January. And somehow, they not only survived, but managed to keep their families fed through winters that would break most of us modern folks within a week. But here's what blows my mind. They had a secret weapon against starvation that we've almost entirely forgotten. Not just one trick, but an entire arsenal of wisdom passed down through generations like precious family heirlooms. These weren't desperate measures. They were sophisticated systems of food science, developed and refined over centuries by people for whom failure meant death. Today we're uncovering 50 of those forgotten secrets that kept them not just surviving, but actually feasting when others faced famine. And fair warning, by the end of this, you're going to realize that our ancestors weren't just getting by, they were absolute masters of turning scarcity into abundance. So before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever tried any traditional food preservation methods. Because I guarantee you, after seeing what medieval peasants could do with nothing but salt, smoke, and sheer ingenuity, you'll never look at your modern kitchen the same way again. The stakes living on the knife's edge. Before we get to their treasure trove of secrets, you need to understand just how precarious life was. We're talking about a world where the distance between a full belly and starvation wasn't measured in months or weeks, but in heartbeats. A single crop failure wasn't just an economic setback, it was a community death sentence. And if you want a picture of just how bad things could get, let me paint you the nightmare that was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. It started innocently enough, with rain. Picture this, across northern Europe, from Ireland to Poland, fields that should have been golden with grain turned into lakes of mud. Crops rotted on the stalk. Hay couldn't be dried, which meant no food for livestock over the winter. Even salt, the absolute cornerstone of medieval food preservation, became scarcer than gold because the endless damp made it impossible to evaporate seawater into brine. The results were beyond apocalyptic. Food prices didn't just rise, they exploded. A bushel of wheat that cost 4 shillings in 1313 was selling for 40 shillings by 1316. That's like your weekly grocery bill going from $100 to $1,000 overnight. People ate anything they could find: tree bark, leather belts, grass, roots, even dirt mixed with flour to make it go further. The chroniclers of the time, monks who were usually pretty restrained in their writing, described scenes that sound like something out of Dante's Inferno. Families abandoning their children because they couldn't feed them. Parents eating their own seed grain, mortgaging next year's harvest just to survive this year. Mass graves filled with people who had literally starved to death in the streets. But here's the thing that's absolutely crucial to understand. This wasn't some freak event that caught everyone by surprise. The medieval world was always teetering on this edge. Bad weather, crop disease, war, pestilence, any one of these could push a community over the brink. The Great Famine was just the most dramatic example of a fear that shaped every single decision a peasant family made. Every morning when they woke up, they were playing a chess game against starvation. Every piece of food was precious. Every preservation technique was literally life insurance. Every community strategy was designed around the assumption that next winter might be the one that kills you. It was from this crucible of constant crisis that their genius was forged. These weren't people who had the luxury of being picky eaters or wasting food. They were scientists and engineers, using every resource around them to build an impregnable fortress of food security. Their solutions weren't just about preserving individual ingredients. They were about creating entire systems of resilience that could weather any storm. So when I tell you about these 50 techniques, I'm not just sharing interesting historical trivia, I'm giving you the accumulated wisdom of people who faced the ultimate test of human ingenuity: how to keep your family alive when the world is trying to kill you. The science of salt and smoke. When you think of medieval food preservation, salt probably comes to mind first, and for good reason. Salt was the white gold of the Middle Ages, so valuable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, hence our word salary, and Venice built an empire on the salt trade. But what most people don't realize is that medieval people weren't just throwing salt at food and hoping for the best. They had developed a sophisticated understanding of food chemistry that would impress modern food scientists. The medieval peasant might not have known about bacteria and osmosis in scientific terms, but they understood the principles perfectly. They knew that salt drew moisture out of food, and they knew that dry food didn't rot. What they had figured out through centuries of experimentation was exactly how much salt to use, how long to leave it, and how to combine it with other preservation methods for maximum effect. Different types of salt had different properties. Sea salt, evaporated from seawater, was coarser and contained trace minerals that added flavor and preservation power. Rock salt, mined from ancient seabeds, was purer and more consistent. Bay salt, harvested from coastal salt marshes, had a distinctive flavor that was prized for certain applications. They understood these differences and used them strategically. Trick hash 1. The art of dry salting. The most fundamental technique was dry salting, but it was far more sophisticated than just rubbing salt on meat. For dry salting, they used coarse salt, pressing it deep into every crevice of the meat. But here's what made them masters. They knew exactly how much salt to use. Too little, and the meat would spoil. Too much, and it became inedibly salty and wastefully expensive. The rule was roughly 1 pound of salt for every 10 pounds of meat, but this varied based on the humidity, temperature, and type of meat. The salted meat was then layered in wooden barrels or stone crocks, with thick layers of salt packed between each piece. The container was then covered and weighted down to press out moisture. After several weeks, what emerged was salt pork or salt beef, rock-hard, intensely salty protein that could last for months without refrigeration. Brine curing for deep penetration. While dry salting worked great for smaller pieces, larger cuts required brine curing. This meant creating a super-saturated saltwater solution so strong that an egg would float on top, a medieval test for brine strength that's actually scientifically accurate. The meat was submerged in this brine for weeks, allowing the salt solution to slowly penetrate every fiber. They often added herbs and spices to the brine. Bay leaves, juniper berries, peppercorns when they could afford them. These weren't just for flavor. Many of these spices have natural antimicrobial properties that added extra protection. Large hams were often brined for months. The process was so refined that different regions developed signature flavors based on their brine recipes and curing times. The famous Westphalian ham tradition, which still exists today, comes directly from medieval brining techniques developed by German peasants. The smoker's art. Smoking was the perfect partner to salting, but it required real skill to do properly. The medieval cottage, with its central hearth and no chimney, was naturally filled with smoke. But this wasn't accidental. It was carefully controlled. Different woods produced different flavors and preservation qualities. Oak burned steady and clean, producing a mild, sweet smoke. Beech added a distinctive nutty flavor. Apple and cherry gave a fruity undertone. Juniper wood was prized for its preservative qualities. It contains natural compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. The salted butter revolution. Fresh milk was seasonal. Cows gave the most milk in spring and summer when grass was abundant. To preserve this precious fat source, medieval dairy makers created what was essentially butter transformed into a completely different product. Fresh butter was churned as usual, but then it was worked extensively to remove every trace of buttermilk and water. It was then mixed with salt, not just a pinch, but up to 10 to 15% of the butter's weight. This super salty butter was then packed tightly into earthenware crocks, with a final layer of pure salt on top to create a complete seal. The salt drew out any remaining moisture and created an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. A properly prepared crock of salted butter made in June would still be perfectly good for cooking the following February. Some wealthy households had butter that was years old. It was considered a mark of good housekeeping to have ancient, well-preserved stores. The jerky masters. Medieval people perfected the art of making jerky centuries before it became a gas station snack. They understood that the key wasn't just drying the meat, but preparing it properly first. Lean meat, venison, beef, even mutton, was cut along the grain into long, thin strips. These were often given a quick dip in brine for a protective, salty coating, then hung to dry. In sunny climates, this could be done outdoors on wooden frames. In the damp north, the strips were hung near the fire, taking advantage of the constant heat and smoke. The result was incredibly nutrient-dense, lightweight protein that could last for months. A peasant working long days in the fields could carry a week's worth of protein in a small pouch. It was the perfect food for travelers, soldiers, and anyone who needed portable nutrition. Blood sausage and the waste not philosophy. For a peasant family, wasting any part of a slaughtered animal was literally throwing away life insurance. This led to the development of foods that might sound strange to modern ears, but were nutritional powerhouses. When a pig was killed, the blood was carefully collected in bowls with salt added immediately to prevent clotting. This blood was then mixed with fillers like oats, barley, diced fat, and herbs, then stuffed into cleaned intestines to create blood sausage or black pudding. The sausages were boiled first to cook them through, then often smoked for additional preservation. The result was an incredibly iron-rich, protein-dense food that captured nutrition that would otherwise be lost. Modern nutritional analysis shows that blood sausage has more iron than most cuts of meat and provides complete amino acids. The medieval ham curing process. The creation of a properly cured ham was a months-long process that represented the pinnacle of peasant food preservation artistry. This wasn't just about making meat last, it was about transforming it into something better than it was fresh. The process began with selecting the right pig. Hams were typically made from pigs that had been fattened on acorns and nuts, which gave the meat a distinctive flavor and better fat distribution. The leg was carefully butchered, leaving a specific amount of fat and skin to protect the meat during curing. The ham was first buried in coarse salt for several weeks, with the salt being changed periodically as it drew out moisture. After this initial cure, the ham was removed, cleaned, and hung in a cool, dry place to begin the aging process. Some families passed down ham curing techniques through generations, with each family having secret spice blends and timing methods. The truly remarkable thing is how long these hams would last. Archaeological evidence from medieval households shows hams that were consumed years after curing, and they were considered delicacies. The long curing process concentrated flavors and created complex chemical changes that actually improved the meat's taste and nutritional value over time. Coastal fish preservation mastery. Medieval coastal communities developed fish preservation techniques that were so effective they became the foundation of international trade. The creation of stockfish cod that was dried without salt until it became hard as wood allowed Norse traders to carry protein on voyages that lasted months. The process required perfect timing and conditions. Fish had to be caught during specific seasons when they were fattest and the weather was right for drying. They were cleaned, beheaded, and tied in pairs by their tails, then hung on wooden racks called shell in areas where they would get consistent air circulation but be protected from rain. The drying process took months, during which the fish lost about 80% of their weight but retained almost all their nutritional value. Properly dried stockfish could last for years and was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency. When prepared for eating, it was soaked in water for days to rehydrate, then cooked into hearty stews that sustained entire communities through winter. The salt economy and creative conservation. Salt was so valuable in medieval times that entire communities organized around conserving and maximizing its use. The salt tax was one of the most hated levies because it literally taxed survival itself. This led to incredibly creative methods for extending salt supplies. Families would save and reuse brine multiple times, adjusting the salt concentration as needed for different preservation tasks. Used brine from meat curing would be strained and used again for vegetables. Some communities developed salt-sharing cooperatives, where multiple families would pool resources to buy salt in bulk, then divide it according to carefully calculated ratios based on family size and preservation needs. These cooperatives often lasted for generations, with detailed records kept of who contributed what and who received how much salt. The creativity extended to salt substitution. In areas where sea salt was prohibitively expensive, people learned to make potash from wood ashes, which provided some of the same preservation properties. They also discovered that certain mineral-rich clays could be used to extend salt supplies, creating preservation compounds that were part salt, part clay, but still effective at preventing spoilage. Harnessing the Earth's power. Before the invention of mechanical refrigeration, the Earth itself was humanity's refrigerator, freezer, and climate-controlled storage facility. Medieval peasants didn't just use the ground to grow food, they understood it as a complex environmental system that could be engineered to preserve food for months or even years. The physics behind Earth storage is elegant. Soil is an excellent insulator, maintaining relatively stable temperatures regardless of surface weather conditions. Below the frost line, temperatures hover between 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 13 degrees Celsius year-round, not quite as cold as a modern refrigerator, but perfect for long-term storage of many foods. Medieval people understood this intuitively and developed sophisticated systems to harness this natural refrigeration. The root cellar architecture. The root cellar was far more than just a hole in the ground. It was a precisely engineered storage system that required knowledge of soil types, drainage, ventilation, and food science. The best root cellars were dug into hillsides, taking advantage of natural earth insulation on 3 sides while providing easy access from the 4th. The depth was critical, too shallow, and temperature would fluctuate with the seasons, too deep, and you'd hit groundwater. The ideal depth was 6 to 8 feet, just below the frost line. Construction details mattered enormously. Stone walls weren't just for structure, they provided thermal mass that helped maintain stable temperatures. The stones were often laid without mortar, allowing the structure to breathe and maintain proper humidity levels. Ventilation was the most sophisticated aspect. A properly designed root cellar had 2 air shafts, a low intake near the floor and a high exhaust near the ceiling. This created a gentle circulation that prevented stagnation and mold, while maintaining the humid conditions that kept vegetables from drying out. The outdoor clamp system. For communities that couldn't afford individual root cellars, or for storing enormous quantities of root vegetables, the clamp system provided an ingenious alternative. This was essentially a temporary above-ground root cellar that could be built quickly with minimal tools. The process began with site selection, a well-drained spot protected from prevailing winds. Root vegetables were arranged in a conical pile, with the largest and hardiest, like turnips and mangolds, on the outside, and more delicate vegetables like carrots in the center. The entire pile was then covered with a thick layer of straw for insulation. Over the straw went a layer of earth, packed down to shed water, but not so thick as to create anaerobic conditions that would cause spoilage. A small tuft of straw was left protruding from the top as a chimney, allowing excess heat and moisture to escape while preventing rain from entering. The beauty of the clamp system was its scalability and flexibility. Small family clamps could store a winter's worth of vegetables for 4 or 5 people. Community clamps could preserve food for entire villages, and if designed properly, they could be mined throughout the winter, opening small sections to remove vegetables while keeping the rest protected. Sand storage technology. Sand storage was one of the most sophisticated preservation techniques, based on principles that modern food science has validated. The key was understanding that different types of sand had different properties, and matching the sand to the food being preserved. For root vegetables like carrots and parsnips, clean, dry sand created perfect storage conditions. The vegetables were layered in wooden boxes or barrels with sand, ensuring that no 2 vegetables touched. The sand served multiple functions. It absorbed excess moisture, preventing rot. It provided insulation against temperature fluctuations, and it created individual microenvironments for each vegetable. The type of sand mattered. River sand was preferred over ocean sand because it lacked salt that could dehydrate vegetables. The sand had to be completely dry. Wet sand would create the humid conditions that promoted decay. Some families would bake their sand in large pans before use, ensuring it was perfectly dry and sterile. Different vegetables required different sand storage techniques. Carrots were buried completely, with their tops removed to prevent moisture loss. Parsnips were stored with some of their greens still attached. Beets required slightly damp sand to prevent them from becoming woody. This knowledge was passed down through generations and represented centuries of careful observation and experimentation. The evaporative cooling revolution. Long before electric refrigeration, medieval people in hot climates had discovered the principles of evaporative cooling and created what amounts to ancient air conditioning for food storage. The basic technique used what we now call a zier pot, two unglazed clay pots, one inside the other, with wet sand filling the space between them. Food was placed in the inner pot and covered with a damp cloth. As water evaporated from the sand and cloth, it absorbed heat energy, cooling the inner pot significantly below ambient temperature. But medieval applications went far beyond this simple design. Entire rooms were cooled using evaporative techniques. Wet cloths were hung in drafty areas, creating cooling as air flowed through them. Stone floors were regularly dampened, and as the water evaporated, it cooled the room. Some wealthy households had elaborate systems with fountains and water features that provided both humidity control and cooling. The science is sound. Evaporation absorbs approximately 2,260 joules of energy per gram of water, making it incredibly effective for cooling. Medieval people understood this intuitively and used it to create storage conditions that could extend the life of fresh foods by days or even weeks. Bog preservation mastery. In regions with peat bogs, medieval people discovered one of nature's most perfect preservation environments. Peat bogs are naturally refrigerated, highly acidic, oxygen-free environments that can preserve organic materials for centuries. The most famous bog-preserved foods were butters. Bog butter has been found in Irish peat bogs that's hundreds of years old, but still technically edible. Families would wrap butter in cloth or pack it in wooden containers, then bury it deep in the bog. The cool temperatures, acidity, and lack of oxygen created perfect preservation conditions. But bog preservation wasn't limited to butter. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval people preserved meat, cheese, and even wooden containers of grain in bog environments. The natural tannins in peat acted as preservatives, while the acidic conditions prevented bacterial growth. The key was understanding bog chemistry and seasonal variations. The best preservation occurred in the deepest, most anaerobic parts of the bog. Families would mark their burial sites carefully and sometimes leave bog caches for years before retrieving them. It was like having a natural safety deposit box that could preserve food indefinitely. Stream cooling networks. Running water provided medieval communities with natural refrigeration that was available 24/7. But the applications went far beyond just sticking a jug of milk in the creek. Elaborate stream cooling systems were built near mills and monasteries. Stone channels would divert stream water into specially constructed cooling chambers where food could be stored in waterproof containers. The constant flow of cold water maintained temperatures well below ambient air temperature. Some communities built communal stream houses, small buildings constructed directly over streams where multiple families could store perishable foods. These stream houses had stone floors with channels carved into them, allowing water to flow directly under crocks and containers of food. The most sophisticated systems included multiple temperature zones. Fast-flowing, shallow water provided the coldest temperatures for items like fresh meat and dairy. Deeper, slower-moving areas maintained moderate cooling suitable for vegetables and prepared foods. Some systems even included heated areas where water warmed by the sun could be used for food preparation. Ice houses and snow preservation. In northern climates, medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for harvesting and storing natural ice and snow, creating refrigeration that could last well into summer. Ice harvesting was a community effort that required careful timing and organization. The best ice came from lakes and ponds that froze quickly in still conditions, creating dense, clear ice that melted slowly. Ice was cut into large blocks using specialized tools, then transported to insulated storage buildings called ice houses. Ice house construction was a specialized art. The buildings were typically built partially underground, with thick stone walls and insulated roofs. The floor was designed for drainage, as melting ice needed somewhere to go. Ice blocks were layered with insulating materials like straw, sawdust, or even crushed snow to slow melting. But medieval people also discovered that snow itself could be an effective preservative. Fresh snow was packed tightly around containers of food, creating insulation that could keep things frozen for weeks. In mountain communities, snow caves were carved out specifically for food storage, taking advantage of the natural insulation properties of compacted snow. The medieval refrigerator well. Some of the most ingenious medieval cooling systems were built around wells and springs. These refrigerator wells were modified to create controlled cooling environments for food storage. The basic principle exploited the fact that groundwater maintains a constant temperature year-round. By creating chambers or platforms at different levels within the well, families could access different temperature zones. Items requiring the coldest storage were lowered to just above the water level. Foods requiring moderate cooling were stored on higher platforms. Pulley systems allowed easy access to different levels of the well. Waterproof containers made from clay, wood, or treated leather protected food from moisture while taking advantage of the cool environment. Some wells had elaborate systems of ropes and baskets that allowed multiple families to share the cooling space. The most advanced well cooling systems included temperature control mechanisms. Wooden covers could be adjusted to control air circulation and temperature. Some wells had chambers carved into their sides at different depths, creating multiple cooling zones with slightly different environmental conditions. Natural cave storage networks. Where natural caves were available, medieval communities developed them into sophisticated food storage networks that could serve entire regions. Cave environments provided ideal storage conditions, constant temperature, controlled humidity, and protection from weather and pests. Different areas within caves had different microclimates, and experienced cave managers learned to match foods to the optimal storage zones. The deepest parts of caves maintained the most stable temperatures and were used for long-term storage of items like aged cheeses, cured meats, and preserved grains. Areas near cave entrances, with more temperature variation and air circulation, were better suited for items requiring ventilation or controlled drying. Cave storage required sophisticated organization and social cooperation. Storage areas were allocated to different families or communities, with complex systems for marking ownership and managing access. Some caves had elaborate internal structures, stone shelves, wooden platforms, and dividing walls that created specialized storage environments. Many cave storage systems included security measures. Entrance tunnels were sometimes deliberately narrowed or blocked to prevent unauthorized access. Some caves had multiple entrances, allowing owners to monitor access while providing emergency evacuation routes if needed. The engineering behind survival. Before we dive deeper into fermentation and drying techniques, let's pause for a moment to appreciate what we've just seen. These weren't primitive people making do with crude methods. These were sophisticated engineers who understood principles that we're only now rediscovering with modern science. The root cellar isn't just a hole in the ground, it's a precisely calculated thermal management system that uses the Earth's natural insulation properties to maintain optimal storage temperatures. The sand storage technique isn't just burying vegetables, it's creating controlled microenvironments that manage moisture, temperature, and air circulation to maximize preservation time. What strikes me most is how these techniques represent systems thinking rather than individual solutions. The medieval peasant didn't just preserve food, they designed entire food systems that worked together. The root cellar connected to the grain storage, connected to the smoking operation, connected to the community sharing networks. Every element reinforced and supported the others. Modern food science has validated virtually every one of these techniques. We now understand the physics of evaporative cooling, the chemistry of salt preservation, the biology of fermentation, But what we've lost is the integrated thinking that made these techniques work as complete survival systems. The medieval approach was inherently sustainable and renewable. A root cellar got better with age, as the earth settled and the internal climate stabilized. Community storage systems strengthened social bonds while improving everyone's food security. These weren't just preservation methods, they were investments in long-term resilience that paid dividends for generations. To the modern mind, bacteria are the enemy. We sanitize, sterilize, and pasteurize in an endless war against microbial life. But medieval peasants understood something we're only now rediscovering. Not all bacteria are bad. In fact, some bacteria are incredibly powerful allies in the fight against food spoilage. Fermentation is essentially controlled spoilage. You encourage specific beneficial microorganisms to grow, and they create an acidic environment that kills off harmful bacteria while transforming food in remarkable ways. The end result isn't just preserved food, it's often more nutritious, more flavorful, and sometimes even easier to digest than the original ingredients. The medieval understanding of fermentation was based on centuries of careful observation and experimentation. They might not have understood the microbiology, but they understood the conditions that promoted good fermentation versus bad spoilage. They knew about temperature control, salt ratios, oxygen exposure, and timing with a precision that would impress modern food scientists. Sauerkraut science. The key was understanding salt ratios. Too little salt, and harmful bacteria would dominate. Too much, and even the good bacteria couldn't survive. The optimal ratio was discovered through generations of experimentation, roughly 2 to 3% salt by weight of cabbage. This created an environment where lactobacillus bacteria could thrive while harmful microorganisms were suppressed. The fermentation vessel mattered enormously. Wooden barrels or ceramic crocks provided the right environment, but they had to be scrupulously clean. Medieval families often had dedicated sauerkraut vessels that were used for nothing else, understanding that resident bacterial populations in the wood or clay improved fermentation over time. The most sophisticated aspect was understanding fermentation stages. The first few days produced a vigorous, bubbling fermentation that converted cabbage sugars into lactic acid. This was followed by a slower secondary fermentation that developed complex flavors and further acidified the product. Master sauerkraut makers could judge fermentation progress by sound, smell, and visual cues. The pickling arts. Medieval pickling went far beyond just soaking vegetables in vinegar. It was a sophisticated understanding of acid chemistry applied to food preservation, with different techniques for different foods and different preservation goals. Vinegar pickling used the acetic acid in vinegar to create an inhospitable environment for spoilage bacteria. But medieval people understood that different foods required different vinegar strengths and different preparation methods. Cucumbers were often salted first to draw out water, concentrating flavors and creating better texture. Onions were sometimes blanched quickly in boiling water to soften their bite while maintaining crunch. Brine pickling used saltwater fermentation to create natural acids while preserving vegetables. This was essentially sauerkraut chemistry applied to other vegetables. Turnips, carrots, and beets were fermented in salt brine, developing complex flavors while achieving long-term preservation. Spice combinations weren't just for flavor. Many medieval pickling spices had antimicrobial properties that enhanced preservation. Dill, coriander, mustard seed, and bay leaves all contain compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. Medieval picklers developed regional spice blends that reflected both local tastes and local availability of preservative spices. The most advanced pickling operations used sequential pickling. Foods were pickled in multiple stages with different acid concentrations and spice combinations, creating complex flavors while ensuring complete preservation. Some pickled foods were aged for months or even years, developing flavors that were completely different from the original ingredients. Cheese making as controlled spoilage. Medieval cheese-making represented perhaps the most sophisticated application of controlled fermentation and aging. What we think of as simple cheese-making was actually complex biotechnology involving multiple types of bacteria precise environmental controls, and aging processes that could last for years. The process began with milk quality. Medieval cheesemakers understood that milk from different seasons, different animals, and different diets produced different cheeses. Spring milk, rich with nutrients from new grass, created the best fresh cheeses. Fall milk, concentrated and rich, was better for aged cheeses that would need to survive winter storage. Curdling agents were chosen carefully. Rennet from different animals produced different textures and flavors. Acid curdling using vinegar or lemon juice created softer, more crumbly cheeses. Some regions used plant-based curdling agents like fig sap or certain flowers, each imparting distinctive characteristics. The pressing and salting processes were precisely calibrated. Different pressures created different textures. Salt was applied at specific stages and in specific amounts to control moisture content and develop proper rind formation. The timing of each step was critical. Too fast, and the cheese would be weak and prone to spoilage. Too slow, and unwanted bacteria could take hold. Aging environments were carefully controlled. Natural caves provided ideal conditions, but medieval cheesemakers also built artificial aging chambers with controlled temperature, humidity, and air circulation. Different cheeses required different aging conditions, and master cheesemakers maintained multiple aging environments to accommodate different types of cheese. The living sourdough culture. The sourdough starter was much more than just a leavening agent. It was a living family heirloom that connected generations and provided food security in ways we rarely appreciate today. These starters were complex ecosystems of wild yeast and bacteria, carefully maintained and cultivated over decades or even centuries. Establishing a starter required understanding wild yeast ecology. Different regions had different populations of wild yeasts, each creating characteristic flavors in the final bread. Medieval bakers learned to capture and cultivate the best local strains by exposing flour and water mixtures to the air under controlled conditions. Maintaining a starter was a daily responsibility that required understanding fermentation chemistry. The starter needed regular feeding with fresh flour and water to keep the microorganisms healthy and active. The ratio of flour to water, the feeding schedule, and the storage temperature all affected the starter's health and flavor profile. Starter management became a sophisticated science. Healthy starters were thick and bubbly, with a pleasant sour smell. Sick starters would develop off odors or strange colors, indicating that harmful bacteria had gained dominance. Medieval bakers developed techniques for rescuing sick starters and maintaining backup cultures in case the primary starter died. The bread produced from these starters wasn't just leavened, it was naturally preserved. The lactic acid produced by the bacterial fermentation created an acidic environment that inhibited mold growth, making sourdough bread last much longer than unleavened bread. Some sourdough breads could remain edible for weeks, making them ideal for long journeys or extended storage. Medieval brewing and fermentation chemistry. Brewing in medieval times wasn't just about making alcoholic beverages. It was about creating safe, nutritious, and storable liquid food that could sustain communities when water sources were contaminated or unreliable. The brewing process began with malting, which was actually controlled sprouting designed to convert grain starches into fermentable sugars. Grain was soaked in water until it began to sprout, then quickly dried to stop the sprouting process. This malting process created enzymes that would later convert starches into sugars during brewing. Different grains produced different characteristics in the final product. Barley was preferred for its enzyme content and flavor, but oats, wheat, and rye were also used depending on availability and desired characteristics. Medieval brewers understood how to blend different grains to achieve specific flavors and nutritional profiles. The fermentation process itself required careful temperature and timing control. Wild yeasts from the environment provided the fermentation organisms, but medieval brewers learned to encourage the right yeasts while suppressing harmful bacteria. They developed techniques for managing fermentation temperature, understanding that cooler temperatures produced cleaner flavors, while warmer temperatures created more complex, sometimes undesirable, characteristics. Small beer, with low alcohol content, was the daily beverage for entire families, including children. It provided calories, vitamins, and hydration, while being much safer than potentially contaminated water. Stronger ales were reserved for special occasions or winter consumption when extra calories were needed. Medieval fermentation went far beyond the basics of sauerkraut and bread. Skilled practitioners developed dozens of fermented products that provided nutrition, flavor, and preservation for specific seasonal and dietary needs. Garum and fermented fish sauces. The medieval version of fermented fish sauce, called garum, was a sophisticated product that concentrated protein and umami flavors while providing long-term preservation. Fish scraps, heads, bones, intestines were layered with coarse salt in large vessels and left to ferment for weeks or months. The fermentation process broke down fish proteins into amino acids, creating intensely flavorful liquids that could be used to season other foods. The high salt content and acidic fermentation environment made these sauces virtually imperishable, allowing families to capture and preserve nutrition from fish parts that would otherwise be wasted. Different regions developed distinctive variations. Coastal communities used whatever fish were abundant: herring, mackerel, sardines. Inland communities sometimes used freshwater fish or even developed vegetarian versions using mushrooms and vegetables. The aging process could last for years, with older sauces considered more valuable and flavorful. Fermented grain beverages beyond beer. Medieval communities developed numerous fermented grain beverages that served different nutritional and preservation purposes. Kvass, made from bread or grain, provided probiotics and vitamins while using up stale bread that would otherwise be wasted. The process involved soaking bread or cooked grains in water, then allowing natural fermentation to occur over several days. The result was a mildly alcoholic, slightly sour beverage that was refreshing and nutritious. Different additions, herbs, fruits, vegetables, created different flavors and nutritional profiles. Some communities developed seasonal fermented beverages based on available ingredients. Spring kvass might include early greens and herbs for vitamin content. Summer versions used fruits and berries. Fall versions incorporated root vegetables and grains from the harvest. Fermented dairy beyond basic cheese. Medieval dairy fermentation produced a wide range of products that served different preservation and nutritional needs. Kefir, made using kefir grains, created a probiotic-rich beverage that could be consumed fresh or stored for extended periods. Buttermilk, the liquid left over from butter making, was often fermented further to create tangy, nutritious beverages. This fermented buttermilk had a much longer shelf life than fresh buttermilk and provided important probiotics and vitamins. Some regions developed cultured butter, where cream was allowed to sour naturally before churning. This created butter with distinctive tangy flavors and better keeping qualities than sweet cream butter. The culturing process also concentrated flavors and created more complex taste profiles. Whey, the liquid left over from cheese making, was often fermented into alcoholic beverages or processed into whey cheeses like ricotta. Some communities developed systems for cascading dairy fermentation, where the byproducts of one fermentation process became the raw materials for another, creating multiple preserved products from a single batch of milk. The art of drying and air curing. Dehydration is humanity's oldest preservation technique, and medieval people elevated it to a sophisticated science. The principle is elegantly simple. Remove water, and you remove the conditions that bacteria need to cause spoilage. But the execution required deep understanding of air circulation, humidity control, temperature management, and timing. Medieval drying techniques went far beyond just hanging things in the sun. They developed specialized structures, understood seasonal timing, and created complex drying schedules that maximized preservation while maintaining nutritional value and flavor. Their methods were so effective that many traditional dried foods could last for years without losing significant nutritional content. Systematic fruit drying operations. Medieval orchards were managed not just for fresh fruit consumption, but as raw materials for sophisticated drying operations that could preserve summer's abundance for winter consumption. Apple drying was particularly advanced. Different varieties were selected for different drying characteristics, Some apples held their shape and flavor better when dried, while others were better suited for pressing into concentrated fruit leathers. Apples were peeled and sliced to specific thicknesses, with experienced dried fruit makers understanding that uniform thickness was crucial for even drying. The drying apparatus itself was sophisticated. Wooden frames covered with cloth or basketwork provided platforms for fruit while allowing air circulation. These frames could be moved to follow the sun or brought indoors during rain. Some operations used elevated drying platforms that took advantage of better air circulation and reduced contamination from ground dust and insects. Temperature management was crucial. Direct sunlight could cook fruit instead of drying it, creating unpleasant flavors and textures. Skilled fruit dryers used partial shade or reflected light to maintain optimal drying temperatures. They also understood that different fruits required different drying conditions. Grapes needed more heat and direct sun, while delicate berries required gentler conditions. Fruit leather technology. Fruit leather represented one of the most advanced food processing techniques developed by medieval communities. The process concentrated fruit flavors while creating products that could last for months without refrigeration. The process began with selecting fruit at optimal ripeness. Overripe fruit created sticky, hard-to-manage leathers, while underripe fruit lacked sufficient sugars for proper preservation. Mixed fruit leathers, using combinations of apples, pears, and berries, created complex flavors while balancing sugar content and acidity. Cooking techniques were precisely controlled. Fruit was cooked slowly in large, shallow pans to concentrate flavors without burning. The addition of honey or concentrated fruit juices could adjust sweetness and improve preservation characteristics. Some recipes included spices like cinnamon or ginger, which added flavor while providing antimicrobial properties. The drying process required specialized equipment and techniques. Fruit puree was spread on greased boards or cloth-lined frames in thin, even layers. The thickness was critical. Too thin, and the leather would become brittle; too thick, and it wouldn't dry properly. Drying surfaces were often oiled or greased to prevent sticking, using rendered animal fat or plant oils. Herb drying and preservation networks. Medieval herb gardens were pharmaceutical laboratories that provided both culinary flavoring and medical treatments. The preservation of herbs required sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry and optimal drying conditions to maintain potency. Different herbs required different drying methods. Leafy herbs like basil and mint needed quick drying to preserve their volatile oils. Woody herbs like rosemary and thyme could be dried more slowly. Root herbs required different techniques entirely, often involving cleaning, chopping, and slow drying over low heat. Bundle drying was the most common method, but it required precise technique. Herbs were harvested at optimal times, usually mid-morning after dew had evaporated, but before the heat of the day drove off essential oils. They were bundled in small groups to ensure adequate air circulation, then hung in areas with good airflow but protection from direct sunlight. Storage techniques were equally important. Properly dried herbs were stored in sealed containers away from light and moisture. Different herbs had different storage requirements. Some maintained potency for years, while others needed to be used within months. Medieval households maintained detailed knowledge of herb storage times and potency retention. Bone broth concentration and storage. The medieval approach to bone broth was far more sophisticated than modern versions, representing a systematic extraction and concentration of nutrition from animal bones that would otherwise be wasted. The process began with bone selection and preparation. Different bones provided different nutritional and flavor characteristics. Marrow bones provided rich fats, joint bones provided collagen, and meat bones provided flavor compounds. Roasting bones before simmering improved flavor extraction and color development. The simmering process was carefully controlled and could last for days. Water levels were maintained to ensure complete extraction without dilution. Some operations used sequential extractions. Bones were simmered multiple times with fresh water to extract every possible nutrient. The concentration phase transformed liquid broth into a preserved product. Broth was simmered down until it became thick and gelatinous, concentrating nutrients and flavors while reducing storage volume. This concentrated broth could be stored in cool conditions for weeks and reconstituted with water when needed. Storage techniques varied by region and season. Some communities molded concentrated broth into blocks that could be wrapped and stored like cheese. Others poured it into containers and sealed it with fat to prevent spoilage. The concentrated broth provided instant nutrition and flavor enhancement for basic grain porridges and vegetable stews. Advanced legume and grain drying. Medieval grain and legume preservation required understanding of moisture content, pest control, and storage environment management. These techniques determined whether communities survived or starved during long winters or crop failures. Harvest timing was critical for optimal preservation. Grains and legumes had to be harvested at exactly the right moisture content. Too wet, and they would mold in storage; too dry, and they would become brittle and lose nutritional value. Medieval farmers developed sophisticated techniques for judging optimal harvest timing based on plant appearance, seed characteristics, and weather conditions. Drying techniques varied by crop and climate. Grains were often field-dried on the plant when weather permitted, then threshed and further dried before storage. In wet climates, sheaves were brought indoors and dried near fires or in specialized drying structures. Some communities built dedicated grain drying buildings with controlled ventilation systems. Pest control during drying was crucial. Various herbs and aromatic plants were incorporated into drying and storage areas to repel insects. Some communities used smoke treatment to eliminate pest eggs and larvae. Meat drying and jerky production systems. Medieval meat drying represented some of the most advanced food processing technology of the time, creating portable, long-lasting protein sources that could sustain travelers, workers, and communities during lean periods. Wind-powered meat drying towers. In regions with consistent winds, medieval communities built specialized drying towers that used natural air circulation to create optimal meat drying conditions. These structures were engineered to channel wind through drying chambers while protecting meat from rain and pests. The towers were typically built on elevated ground to capture maximum wind flow. Internal structures created channels and platforms that maximized air circulation around hanging meat. Some towers included adjustable vents and baffles that allowed operators to control airflow based on weather conditions and drying requirements. Different levels within the towers provided different drying conditions. Upper levels, with stronger airflow and lower humidity, were used for initial drying phases. Lower levels provided gentler conditions for final drying and aging. Seaweed harvesting and preservation. Coastal communities developed sophisticated systems for harvesting and preserving seaweed, creating nutrient-dense foods that could provide essential vitamins and minerals during winter months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Seaweed harvesting required understanding of tidal cycles, seasonal growth patterns, and species identification. Different seaweeds had different nutritional profiles and preservation characteristics. Some were best harvested in spring when growth was most vigorous, while others were better in fall when they had accumulated nutrients for winter survival. Drying techniques were adapted to seaweed's high moisture content and delicate structure. Rapid drying was essential to prevent spoilage, but excessive heat could destroy nutritional content. Seaweed was typically spread on elevated platforms with maximum air circulation, often in areas with natural wind flow. Storage methods protected dried seaweed from moisture reabsorption and pest damage. Properly dried seaweed was packed in sealed containers with natural desiccants like salt or dried grains. Some communities developed trade networks that distributed preserved seaweed far inland, providing coastal nutrition to inland communities. Hardtack production and long-term grain storage. Hardtack represented the ultimate in long-term grain preservation, creating virtually indestructible food that could last for years while remaining edible and nutritious. The production process was deceptively simple but required precise technique. Flour and water were mixed into a stiff dough with minimal ingredients. Salt was sometimes added, but fat, sugar, or other additions would reduce shelf life. The dough was rolled thin and cut into precise sizes for even baking. Baking techniques were crucial for creating the proper texture and preservation characteristics. Hardtack had to be baked until completely dry throughout, with no residual moisture that could support mold or bacterial growth. Storage techniques protected hardtack from moisture reabsorption and pest damage. It was typically stored in sealed containers with desiccants, often in elevated locations away from ground moisture. Some operations wrapped hardtack in waterproof materials for transport or long-term storage. The innovation imperative. We're now halfway through these 50 techniques, and I want you to pause and consider something remarkable. Every single method we've discussed so far was developed by people who had no access to scientific instruments, no understanding of microbiology, no knowledge of nutritional chemistry, yet their techniques work better than many modern preservation methods. How is that possible? The answer lies in what I call the innovation imperative. When failure means death, when there's no safety net, when you can't just drive to the store if your preservation fails, you become incredibly motivated to understand how things actually work. Medieval people couldn't afford to rely on techniques that failed even 10% of the time, because that 10% failure rate meant starvation. So they developed multiple redundant systems. They didn't just salt their meat, they salted it, smoked it, dried it, and stored it in controlled environments. This is systems thinking driven by survival necessity. Modern food preservation often relies on single methods: refrigeration, chemical preservatives, vacuum packing. Medieval preservation used integrated approaches where each method reinforced and backed up the others. The sophistication of their understanding becomes clear when you realize that modern food science has validated virtually every technique they developed. The salt ratios for optimal preservation, the pH levels for safe fermentation, the moisture content for proper drying, they figured all of this out through careful observation and experimentation, hundreds of years before we understood the scientific principles involved. But perhaps most importantly, their techniques were sustainable and regenerative. A root cellar got better with use. Fermentation cultures improved over time. Drying equipment could be maintained and repaired indefinitely. These weren't just preservation methods, they were investments in long-term food security that paid dividends for generations. Community survival networks. Individual preservation techniques, no matter how sophisticated, were only part of medieval food security. The real genius lay in community-level systems that distributed risk, shared resources, and ensured that everyone had access to preservation knowledge and equipment. Medieval communities understood that food security was fundamentally a social challenge as much as a technical one. No single family could master every preservation technique, maintain every type of storage facility, or survive every possible crisis alone. The gleaning rights system. The right of gleaning wasn't just charity, it was a sophisticated social technology that ensured maximum resource utilization while providing a safety net for the most vulnerable community members. But the social engineering went deeper. Gleaning rights created social obligations that strengthened community bonds. Those who benefited from gleaning were often expected to contribute labor during other community activities, helping with preservation work, maintaining community facilities, or providing services to other community members. The economic impact was significant. Archaeological studies of medieval communities show that gleaning rights could provide 10 to 15% of a poor family's annual grain needs. This wasn't just supplemental income, it was often the difference between survival and starvation during difficult years. Different communities developed variations on the gleaning system. Some allowed gleaning of orchards after the main fruit harvest. Others extended gleaning rights to include fallen nuts, forgotten vegetables, and even the collection of dung from harvested fields for fertilizer. The most sophisticated systems created gleaning cooperatives where multiple families would work together to maximize collection efficiency. Communal processing facilities. But communal ovens served multiple preservation functions beyond bread baking. After bread was done, the residual heat was used for drying fruits, vegetables, and herbs. Some communities used oven heat for pottery firing, creating the ceramic vessels needed for fermentation and storage. The social aspects were as important as the technical. Oven days became community gatherings where information was shared, preservation techniques were taught, and social bonds were strengthened. The three-field agricultural system. The three-field system represented one of humanity's most successful sustainable agriculture systems, designed to maximize food production while maintaining soil fertility and providing community resilience against crop failures. The system divided community agricultural land into three large fields, each following a different rotation schedule. One field would be planted with winter grains like wheat or rye. The second field would be planted with spring crops like oats, barley, peas, or beans. The third field would be left fallow, unplanted, and available for livestock grazing. The genius was in the rotation. Each year the fields would shift roles, so no field was continuously cropped with the same plants. This prevented soil depletion and reduced pest and disease pressure. The legume crops, peas and beans, actually improved soil fertility by fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. The fallow fields provided grazing for livestock, whose manure fertilized the soil for the next year's crops. But the system also provided food security through diversification. If one crop failed due to weather, disease, or pests, the other crops might still succeed. Spring and fall plantings meant that communities had two chances each year for successful harvests. The variety of crops provided nutritional diversity and different preservation characteristics. The social coordination required was enormous. Entire communities had to agree on field assignments, planting schedules, and grazing rights. Livestock management had to be coordinated so that animals grazed appropriately without damaging crops. The system required long-term thinking and community cooperation that extended across generations. Wild food networks and foraging cooperatives. Medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for harvesting wild foods that went far beyond individual families gathering whatever they could find. These were organized networks that managed wild resources sustainably while ensuring equitable access for all community members. Different families or groups often specialized in different types of wild food gathering. Some became experts in mushroom identification and harvesting. Others specialized in nut collection, berry gathering, or medicinal plant harvesting. This specialization allowed communities to maximize wild food collection while developing deep expertise in safe identification and optimal harvesting techniques. Seasonal coordination was crucial. Different wild foods were available at different times, and optimal harvesting required precise timing. Territory management prevented conflicts and ensured sustainable use. Different areas might be allocated to different families or groups, with rotation systems that prevented overexploitation. Some areas were designated as emergency reserves, only to be harvested during food crises. Knowledge sharing was formalized through teaching systems that ensured critical foraging knowledge wasn't lost. Experienced foragers taught identification techniques, harvesting methods, and processing skills to younger community members. Some communities maintained detailed records of foraging locations, seasonal timing, and preparation methods. The perpetual pottage system. The pottage pot represented more than just a cooking method. It was a community food security system that minimized waste while maximizing nutrition and social cooperation. The basic principle was simple. The pot was never completely emptied. Instead, new ingredients were continuously added to existing stew, creating an ever-evolving meal that incorporated whatever foods were available. This system ensured that no food was wasted and that families always had something to eat, even when individual ingredients were scarce. But the social implications were profound. Pottage pots became centers of community food sharing. Neighbors would contribute ingredients when they had surplus and benefit from the pot when they had shortages. This created informal but powerful social insurance systems where community members supported each other through difficult periods. The nutritional advantages were significant. Continuous cooking broke down tough fibers and made nutrients more bioavailable. The slow simmering extracted maximum nutrition from bones and vegetable scraps. The fermentation that occurred in the pot actually created beneficial bacteria and improved digestibility. Different communities developed variations on the pottage system. Some maintained communal pots that fed multiple families. Others developed rotation systems where different families took responsibility for maintaining the pot on different days. Some communities had specialized pots for different types of meals or different seasons. Strategic livestock management networks. Medieval livestock management was far more sophisticated than individual families keeping a few animals. Communities developed integrated systems that maximized meat production while minimizing winter feeding costs and providing shared access to animal products. Breeding programs were coordinated at the community level. The best bulls, boars, and rams were shared among multiple families to improve overall herd quality. Some communities maintained communal breeding animals that were too expensive for individual families to keep. This shared approach improved genetics while distributing costs. Seasonal grazing management required community coordination. Common lands were managed to provide grazing for all community animals. While preventing overuse, grazing schedules were coordinated so that different areas could rest and recover. Slaughter timing was strategically coordinated. Most animals were slaughtered in late autumn to avoid winter feeding costs, but this created enormous quantities of meat that had to be processed quickly. Communities developed systems for sharing slaughter work, preservation equipment, and even meat distribution to ensure that everyone benefited from the autumn slaughter. Processing cooperation made efficient use of specialized skills and equipment. Not every family had the knowledge or equipment for sophisticated meat processing, so communities developed systems where skilled processors worked on multiple families' animals in exchange for shares of the final products. This ensured high-quality preservation while building social connections. Emergency food networks. Medieval communities developed sophisticated emergency response systems that could be activated during food crises, ensuring that even the most vulnerable community members had access to survival resources. Seed banking was community-level insurance against crop failures. Communities maintained emergency seed reserves that could be used to replant if crops failed or were destroyed. These seed banks were carefully managed, with seeds rotated regularly to maintain viability. Access to emergency seeds was controlled to ensure they were used appropriately and maintained for future emergencies. Food stockpiling at the community level provided reserves that individual families couldn't maintain. Community granaries, often associated with churches or manor houses, stored surplus grain during good years that could be distributed during famines. These systems required sophisticated management to prevent spoilage and ensure equitable distribution. Crisis protocols established clear procedures for food distribution during emergencies. Communities developed systems for rationing scarce foods, prioritizing distribution to vulnerable members, and coordinating with neighboring communities during widespread crises. These systems were often formalized in community laws or customs that ensured consistent application during stressful periods. Resource-sharing networks allowed communities to support each other during localized crises. If one community experienced crop failure while neighbors had surplus, formal or informal networks facilitated food sharing. These networks often extended over large geographic areas, providing resilience against regional disasters. Fat and oil mastery. Medieval people understood something that modern nutritionists are rediscovering. Fats are not just calories. They're essential preservation agents that can transform ordinary ingredients into long-lasting nutrient-dense foods. Fat preservation wasn't just about rendering animal fat. It was a sophisticated science that used fat's unique properties to create preserved foods that could last for months or even years. The key insight was understanding that fat is essentially waterless. Bacteria and mold need water to survive, so foods preserved in fat exist in an environment where spoilage organisms simply can't function. But medieval people took this basic principle and developed incredibly sophisticated applications that maximize both preservation and nutrition. The art of rendering and fat storage. Animal fat rendering was far more complex than just melting fat in a pot. Different types of fat had different characteristics and required different processing methods to achieve optimal preservation qualities. Leaf lard, the fat from around pig kidneys, was considered the highest quality because it had the cleanest flavor and best preservation characteristics. It was rendered slowly at low temperatures to avoid scorching, which would create off flavors and reduce preservation effectiveness. The rendering process had to remove all water and protein residues, which could cause rancidity. Tallow from beef and mutton required different techniques because it was harder and had a higher melting point. It was often rendered in large batches using specialized equipment that could maintain consistent temperatures. The quality of tallow depended on the animal's diet and age, with grass-fed animals producing superior fat with better flavor and preservation characteristics. Storage techniques were crucial for maintaining fat quality over time. Rendered fat was stored in sealed containers away from light and air, which could cause rancidity. Some communities developed underground fat storage systems that maintained cool, stable temperatures year-round. The best storage containers were ceramic or wooden vessels that had been seasoned specifically for fat storage. Quality control involved testing fat for proper rendering and storage characteristics. Properly rendered fat should be clear when melted, solid at room temperature, and free from water or protein residues. Experienced fat processors could judge quality by appearance, smell, and texture, identifying problems before they affected the preserved foods. Confit, the science of fat preservation. Confit represents one of the most sophisticated applications of fat preservation, creating preserved meats that were not only long-lasting, but actually improved in flavor and texture over time. The process began with salt curing meats to remove moisture and concentrate flavors. Different cuts required different curing times and salt concentrations. Duck legs might be cured for 24 hours, while larger cuts like pork shoulders required several days. Cooking in fat required precise temperature control. The meat had to be cooked slowly in fat, heated to exactly the right temperature, hot enough to cook the meat thoroughly, but not so hot as to fry it. This slow cooking process broke down tough connective tissues while preserving moisture and creating tender, flavorful results. Fat selection was crucial for proper confit. The fat had to be pure, properly rendered, and compatible with the meat being preserved. Duck confit used duck fat, pork confit used lard, and so on. Using the animal's own fat created the best flavor compatibility and preservation characteristics. Storage techniques created completely sealed environments that excluded air and moisture. Cooked meat was packed in containers and completely covered with the cooking fat, ensuring no air contact. The containers were sealed and stored in cool locations where the fat would remain solid. Properly made confit could last for months and actually improved in flavor over time. Vegetable oil preservation systems. While animal fats were most common, medieval communities also developed sophisticated systems for preserving foods and plant oils, creating unique flavors while achieving long-term storage. Oil pressing required specialized equipment and techniques that were often community-owned due to their expense and complexity. Oil presses used leverage systems to extract oil from nuts, seeds, and olives. The pressing process had to balance extraction efficiency with oil quality. Too much pressure or heat would create off flavors and reduce preservation effectiveness. Different plant oils had different preservation characteristics. Olive oil was prized for its stability and flavor, but it was expensive and not available in northern climates. Walnut oil had excellent flavor, but required careful handling to prevent rancidity. Seed oils from flax, hemp, and other plants provided preservation options but had different flavor profiles and storage requirements. Storage and quality management required understanding plant oil chemistry. Plant oils were more susceptible to rancidity than animal fats, so they required more careful storage conditions. Light, heat, and air all accelerated oil degradation, so preservation systems had to protect oils from these factors while maintaining access for use. Tallow candles as emergency food. Candle making required understanding fat chemistry and wick technology. The tallow had to be properly rendered and filtered to burn cleanly without excessive smoke or odor. Different fat blends created candles with different burning characteristics. Pure beef tallow burned longest, while sheep tallow burned brighter. Wick technology was surprisingly sophisticated. Wicks had to be the right size and made from the right materials to burn properly with different fat compositions. Cotton, linen, and rush wicks all had different characteristics. The wick had to burn at the right rate to consume the melted fat without drowning in it or burning too fast. Emergency consumption required understanding which candles were safe to eat and which weren't. Candles made from pure, properly rendered animal fat were essentially edible fat that could provide emergency calories. However, candles that included additives for color or scent, or that had been stored in contaminated conditions, might not be safe for consumption. Community fat storage systems. Managing fats at the community level provided benefits that individual families couldn't achieve alone. Community fat storage systems pooled resources, shared expertise, and provided backup supplies during emergencies. Communal rendering operations made efficient use of specialized equipment and fuel. Large-scale fat rendering required substantial fires and equipment that individual families couldn't afford or maintain. Community rendering days brought together animals from multiple families, making efficient use of fuel while ensuring consistent quality. Storage cooperatives managed large quantities of rendered fat more effectively than individual storage. Large storage vessels maintained more stable temperatures and provided better protection from air and light. Community storage also allowed for better quality control, with experienced managers monitoring fat condition and rotating stock to ensure freshness. Distribution systems ensured that all community members had access to preserved fats for their own food preservation needs. Some communities maintained fat banks where families could deposit fat during rendering season and withdraw it as needed throughout the year. These systems required careful record keeping and management, but provided significant benefits to all participants. Quality control at the community level was more sophisticated than individual efforts. Experienced fat managers could identify problems early and take corrective action. Community systems also provided backup supplies when individual family fat stores were compromised by spoilage or contamination. Sweet preservation, sugar and honey technologies. Before refined sugar became widely available, honey was the primary sweetener in medieval Europe, but it was far more than just a luxury ingredient. Honey was a powerful preservation agent with unique antimicrobial properties that made it invaluable for food preservation. Medieval communities developed sophisticated techniques for using honey and other natural sweeteners to create preserved foods that lasted for months while providing essential nutrition. The science behind honey preservation is fascinating. Honey's low water activity and acidic pH create an environment where harmful bacteria simply cannot survive. Additionally, honey contains natural antimicrobial compounds, including hydrogen peroxide, that actively fight bacterial growth. Medieval people might not have understood the chemistry, but they understood the results. Foods preserved in honey lasted longer than almost any other preservation method. Honey as universal preservative. Pure honey, properly managed, never spoils. This remarkable property made it the ultimate preservation medium for foods that needed long-term storage while maintaining their nutritional and medicinal properties. Honey preservation worked by completely excluding water from preserved foods. Fruits, herbs, and even small pieces of meat could be submerged in honey, creating an anaerobic antimicrobial environment that prevented spoilage indefinitely. The key was using honey with low water content and ensuring complete coverage of the preserved items. Different types of honey had different preservation characteristics. Darker honeys like buckwheat or heather honey had stronger antimicrobial properties due to higher levels of antioxidants and enzymes. Lighter honeys, like clover or linden, had milder flavors that didn't overpower delicate preserved foods. Medieval beekeepers understood these differences and managed their hives to produce honey suitable for different preservation applications. The most valuable honey-preserved foods were medicinal herbs and spices. Ginger, garlic, and other medicinal plants could be preserved in honey for years while maintaining their therapeutic properties. These honey-preserved medicines were incredibly valuable, both for their healing properties and as trade goods that could be transported over long distances. Fruit preservation in honey created confections that were both treats and nutrition reserves. Berries, small fruits, and even flower petals could be preserved in honey, creating foods that retained much of their original nutritional content while gaining the preservation benefits of honey. These preserved fruits provided essential vitamins during winter months when fresh fruits were unavailable. Medieval candying and sugar concentration. Long before refined sugar was available, medieval confectioners developed sophisticated techniques for concentrating natural fruit sugars and creating preserved foods that could last for months while providing concentrated nutrition and energy. Fruit leather technology was far more advanced than simple sun drying. Fruits were cooked slowly to concentrate their natural sugars while removing water. The cooking process required careful temperature control to avoid burning while achieving proper sugar concentration. Different fruits required different cooking times and techniques based on their natural sugar and pectin content. Honey-fruit combinations created preserved foods that combined the preservation properties of both honey and concentrated fruit sugars. Fruits were partially dried, then combined with honey in proportions that created optimal preservation while maintaining palatability. These combinations often included spices like cinnamon or ginger, which added antimicrobial properties while creating complex flavors. Sugar concentration techniques used evaporation to create fruit syrups and concentrates that could be stored for extended periods. Medieval cooks understood that sufficiently concentrated sugar solutions would not support bacterial growth, creating natural preservatives from fruit juices. These concentrates could be reconstituted with water or used as flavoring agents for other foods. Crystallization techniques created primitive forms of candy that were both treats and preservation methods. By carefully controlling cooling and stirring, concentrated fruit and honey mixtures could be encouraged to crystallize, creating solid preserved foods that were easy to store and transport. These early candies were often medicinal, incorporating herbs and spices for therapeutic properties. Advanced candied food production. Candying represented one of the most sophisticated food preservation techniques, creating foods that were essentially imperishable while maintaining much of their original nutritional value. The candying process began with careful preparation of raw materials. Fruits and vegetables had to be blanched or partially cooked to soften their structure and allow sugar penetration. Different foods required different preparation methods. Root vegetables needed longer cooking, while delicate fruits required gentler treatment. Sugar syrup preparation was a precise science that required understanding sugar concentration and temperature control. The syrup had to be strong enough to preserve the food, but not so concentrated as to crystallize prematurely. The infusion process required patience and skill. Foods were immersed in sugar syrup and heated gently, allowing the syrup to penetrate the food structure while driving out water. This process was often repeated multiple times with increasingly concentrated syrups, gradually replacing the food's water content with preservation sugar. Drying and finishing techniques created the final preserved products. After sugar infusion, foods were removed from syrup and dried slowly to create a stable preserved product. Some candied foods were dusted with additional sugar or spices to prevent sticking and add flavor. The final products could last for months or even years when properly stored. Mead production as honey storage. Mead production wasn't just about creating alcoholic beverages. It was a sophisticated method for preserving honey's nutritional and caloric value while creating products that could be stored safely for extended periods. Fermentation control techniques managed the conversion of honey sugars into alcohol while preserving nutritional content. Temperature control was crucial. Too warm, and fermentation would proceed too quickly, creating harsh flavors. Too cool, and beneficial yeasts couldn't compete with harmful microorganisms. Medieval mead makers developed techniques for maintaining optimal fermentation temperatures using natural heating and cooling methods. Aging and storage systems created meads that improved over time while providing long-term storage for honey's nutritional value. Properly made mead could be stored for years, actually improving in flavor and complexity over time. Some medieval meads were aged for decades, becoming incredibly valuable both as beverages and as concentrated nutrition reserves. Flavoring and medicinal additions created specialized meads that served multiple purposes. Herbs, spices, and medicinal plants were often added during fermentation, creating beverages that provided both nutrition and therapeutic benefits. These medicinal meads were particularly valuable during winter months when fresh medicinal plants were unavailable. honeycomb storage and wax technologies. Medieval beekeeping involved managing not just honey production, but the entire hive ecosystem to create multiple preserved products that could sustain communities through difficult periods. Honeycomb harvesting required understanding bee biology and seasonal cycles. Different times of year produced honeycomb with different characteristics. Spring honey was lighter and more liquid, while fall honey was darker and more concentrated. Medieval beekeepers learned to harvest honeycomb at optimal times for different preservation applications. Wax extraction and processing created valuable preservation materials beyond just the honey. Beeswax was used for sealing containers, waterproofing materials, and creating protective coatings for other preserved foods. The wax extraction process had to separate wax from honey without contaminating either product. Comb storage techniques preserved both honey and wax in their natural state. Whole honeycomb could be stored in sealed containers, providing access to both honey and wax as needed. The natural structure of the comb provided protection for the honey while making it easy to access small quantities without exposing the entire storage. Combined preservation systems used both honey and wax to create multi-layered preservation methods. Foods preserved in honey could be sealed with wax coatings, creating double protection against spoilage. These combined systems were particularly useful for valuable or delicate preserved foods that required maximum protection. Grain mastery and seed banking. Grains were the foundation of medieval nutrition, providing the bulk of calories that sustained entire populations. But grain preservation was about far more than just storing wheat and barley. It was a sophisticated system that included seed banking, processing techniques, emergency food production, and community-level storage systems that could mean the difference between survival and starvation for entire communities. Medieval people understood that grain security was civilization security. Communities that mastered grain preservation techniques could survive crop failures, support larger populations, and maintain stability through difficult periods. Those that didn't could face catastrophic famines that decimated entire regions. The miller's strategic storage systems. Medieval mills weren't just grain processing facilities, they were the centers of sophisticated storage and distribution networks that managed grain supplies for entire communities. Mill design incorporated advanced storage technologies that protected grain from moisture, pests, and theft. Multi-story mill buildings used gravity-fed systems that moved grain efficiently while providing multiple storage environments with different characteristics. Upper floors provided dry storage for long-term grain reserves, while lower floors offered easier access for daily processing needs. Pest control systems used both physical and biological methods to protect stored grain. Mills were built with smooth stone or plaster surfaces that provided no hiding places for insects. Quality control involved sophisticated testing and monitoring systems that ensured grain remained viable and nutritious throughout storage periods. Experienced millers could assess grain quality by sight, smell, and feel, identifying problems before they spread to entire storage batches. Different grades of grain were separated and stored differently based on their intended uses and storage requirements. Community distribution systems ensured that grain reserves were available when needed, while preventing hoarding or waste. Mills often served as community grain banks, where families could store surplus grain during abundant years and withdraw it during lean periods. These systems required careful record-keeping and community management, but provided security that individual families couldn't achieve alone. Sprouting technologies for winter nutrition. Medieval communities discovered that controlled sprouting could transform stored grains into fresh, vitamin-rich foods during winter months when fresh vegetables were unavailable. This technique provided essential nutrition while making efficient use of grain reserves. Sprouting methods varied by grain type and desired outcome. Wheat and barley were commonly sprouted for fresh nutrition, while legumes like peas and beans provided protein-rich sprouts. Different grains required different sprouting conditions. Some needed more moisture, others required specific temperatures, and timing was crucial for optimal nutrition and flavor. Environmental control created optimal sprouting conditions using simple but effective techniques. Sprouting containers were often kept near fires for warmth, covered with damp cloths for humidity control and positioned to receive indirect light. Medieval sprouters understood that different stages of sprouting provided different nutritional benefits and flavors. Preservation of sprouted grains extended their usefulness beyond immediate consumption. Partially sprouted grains could be dried and stored, providing improved nutritional content compared to unsprouted grains. Some sprouted grains were processed into flours or meal that retained enhanced nutritional qualities while providing storage stability. Integration with other preservation methods created comprehensive nutrition systems. Sprouted grains were often added to fermented foods, providing fresh nutrients to sauerkraut or other preserved vegetables. They were also incorporated into bread making, creating more nutritious loaves with improved digestibility. Emergency flour from alternative sources. When traditional grain sources failed, medieval communities had developed techniques for creating flour from alternative sources, including tree bark, nuts, legumes, and wild plants. Bark flour production used the inner bark cambium of trees like birch, pine, and oak. The bark had to be harvested at specific times when nutrient content was highest, typically in spring when sap was flowing. Processing involved drying, grinding, and often fermentation to improve digestibility and remove bitter compounds. Acorn flour represented one of the most sophisticated alternative flour technologies. Acorns required extensive processing to remove toxic tannins, but the resulting flour was highly nutritious and could substitute for grain flour in many applications. Legume flour production transformed peas, beans, and other protein-rich seeds into flour that could supplement or replace grain flour. Different legumes required different processing methods. Some could be ground directly, while others needed cooking, drying, and then grinding to achieve proper texture and digestibility. Wild plant flour expanded options even further. Plants like cattail roots, wild rice, and various seeds could be processed into flours that provided calories and nutrition when traditional grains were unavailable. Knowledge of these alternative sources was carefully maintained and passed down through generations as essential emergency knowledge. Community seed banking systems. Medieval communities understood that maintaining seed supplies was just as important as food preservation. Without seeds, there could be no future harvests. Sophisticated seed banking systems ensured genetic diversity and community food security. Seed selection involved understanding plant genetics and breeding principles. The best plants were identified during harvest season, and their seeds were saved for next year's planting. Medieval farmers understood that selecting seeds from the strongest, most productive plants would improve future harvests, though they didn't understand the genetic mechanisms involved. Storage techniques protected seeds from moisture, pests, and fungal infections while maintaining viability for planting. Seeds were dried thoroughly, often mixed with protective substances like wood ash or aromatic herbs, and stored in sealed containers in cool, dry locations. Different types of seeds required different storage methods based on their natural characteristics. Community coordination ensured genetic diversity and prevented total crop loss. No single family saved seeds of all varieties. Instead, different families specialized in maintaining different types of grains, vegetables, and other crops. This distributed approach provided security against individual storage failures while maintaining genetic diversity in community crops. Emergency protocols protected seed supplies during food crises. Communities developed strict rules about seed consumption during famines, understanding that eating seed grain was essentially eating next year's harvest. Emergency seed reserves were maintained specifically for replanting after crop failures or other disasters. Advanced grain processing and storage. Medieval grain processing went far beyond simple grinding, involving sophisticated techniques that improved nutrition, enhanced preservation, and created diverse food products from basic grain supplies. Malting processes converted grain starches into sugars while improving digestibility and creating ingredients for brewing and baking. Controlled sprouting activated enzymes that broke down complex carbohydrates, making nutrients more available while creating flavors that enhanced bread and beer production. Fermentation techniques created grain-based foods that were more nutritious and longer-lasting than simple grain products. Fermented grain porridges and gruels provided probiotics and improved protein availability while lasting longer than cooked but unfermented grain dishes. Specialized grinding techniques created different grain products suitable for different preservation and cooking applications. Coarse meals cooked differently than fine flours, and different grinding techniques created products with different storage characteristics and nutritional profiles. Processing timing optimization coordinated grain processing with seasonal conditions to achieve optimal results. Different times of year provided different conditions for grinding, drying, and storage, and experienced grain processors understood how to time their work for maximum effectiveness. Emergency and famine foods. Medieval communities developed extensive knowledge of emergency food sources that could sustain life during the worst famines and crop failures. These weren't just desperate measures, they were sophisticated nutritional strategies that could provide essential calories and nutrients when conventional food sources failed. The knowledge of famine foods was carefully maintained and passed down through generations because communities understood that famines were not rare disasters but recurring challenges that required preparation and expertise. Those communities that maintained this knowledge survived famines that devastated others. Pine cambium was particularly valuable because pine trees were abundant in northern climates, and their cambium was available throughout the year. The bark had to be harvested carefully to avoid killing the tree. Experienced bark harvesters could take sustainable quantities that allowed trees to recover and continue providing future emergency food. Processing techniques removed bitter compounds while preserving nutritional content. Fresh cambium was often sliced thin and dried, creating strips that could be ground into flour or eaten directly. Some communities developed fermentation techniques that improved flavor and digestibility while creating preserved products that could be stored for extended periods. Preparation methods transformed raw cambium into palatable foods. The processed bark could be ground into flour and mixed with other ingredients to create breads or porridges. Some communities developed recipes that combined cambium with available fats, sweeteners, or other foods to create more nutritious and palatable meals. Seasonal timing optimized cambium harvesting for maximum nutritional content and minimal tree damage. Spring harvesting, when sap was flowing, provided cambium with higher sugar content and better flavor. Fall harvesting allowed communities to prepare cambium supplies before winter, when other food sources were scarce. Acorn processing and storage networks. Acorns represented one of the most important emergency food sources in medieval Europe, but they required sophisticated processing to remove toxic tannins while preserving their high caloric and nutritional content. Species identification was crucial because different oak species produced acorns with different tannin levels and processing requirements. White oak acorns had lower tannin content and required less processing, while red oak acorns were more bitter but often more abundant. Communities maintained detailed knowledge of local oak species and optimal harvesting locations. Leaching processes removed toxic tannins through careful water management. Shelled acorns were ground coarse and placed in baskets lined with cloth or leather. Water was poured through the ground acorns repeatedly until the runoff was no longer bitter, indicating that tannins had been removed. This process could take days or weeks depending on acorn type and processing methods. Processing equipment included specialized tools and containers for efficient acorn processing. Stone mortars and pestles were used for grinding, while specialized baskets and containers facilitated leaching. Some communities built permanent leaching installations near streams or springs that could process large quantities of acorns efficiently. Storage systems preserved processed acorn flour for extended periods. Leached acorn meal had to be dried thoroughly to prevent spoilage, then stored in sealed containers away from moisture and pests. Properly processed and stored acorn flour could provide emergency nutrition for months or even years. Wild seed and grass harvesting. Medieval communities identified and utilized dozens of wild plants that produced edible seeds, providing emergency nutrition when cultivated crops failed. Processing methods cleaned and prepared wild seeds for consumption. Seeds often required winnowing to separate grain from chaff, cleaning to remove debris, and sometimes parching or roasting to improve flavor and digestibility. Some seeds required grinding or other processing to make them suitable for human consumption. Timing knowledge ensured optimal harvesting of wild seeds. Different plants produce seeds at different times, and experienced foragers knew exactly when each species would be ready for harvest. This knowledge allowed communities to plan wild seed collection as part of their annual food security strategy. Storage techniques preserved wild seeds for use during extended emergencies. Wild seeds often had different storage requirements than cultivated grains, requiring specific moisture levels and protection from different types of pests. Communities developed specialized storage methods for different types of wild seeds. Lichen and moss food preparation. In the most extreme famines, medieval communities turned to lichens and mosses, which could provide essential calories and nutrients when nothing else was available. Species identification separated edible lichens and mosses from toxic or indigestible varieties. Rock tripe, Iceland moss, and reindeer lichen were among the most important emergency food lichens. Different species required different preparation methods and provided different nutritional benefits. Preparation techniques made these unconventional foods digestible and palatable. Most lichens required extensive boiling to break down complex carbohydrates and remove bitter compounds. Some preparation methods involved multiple cooking stages with water changes to improve flavor and digestibility. Nutritional enhancement combined lichen and moss foods with other available ingredients to improve their nutritional value. Adding available fats, sweeteners, or other foods could significantly improve both the palatability and nutritional content of these emergency foods. Community coordination managed lichen and moss harvesting to ensure sustainable collection while meeting emergency needs. Overharvesting these slow-growing organisms could eliminate future emergency food sources, so communities developed guidelines for sustainable collection during famines. Seasonal mastery and natural timing. Medieval food preservation was fundamentally organized around natural cycles and seasonal rhythms. Understanding these patterns wasn't just helpful, it was essential for survival. Communities that mastered seasonal timing could predict food availability, optimize preservation activities, and plan for future needs with remarkable accuracy. This seasonal knowledge represented centuries of accumulated observation and experimentation. Medieval people understood that every preservation activity had an optimal time, and timing these activities correctly could mean the difference between successful food preservation and catastrophic failure. The agricultural calendar system. Medieval communities developed sophisticated calendar systems that coordinated all food production and preservation activities with natural cycles and seasonal conditions. Phenological indicators used natural phenomena to determine optimal timing for different activities. The appearance of specific flowers, the behavior of animals, weather patterns, and astronomical events all provided information about when to plant, harvest, preserve, and consume different foods. These natural indicators were often more reliable than fixed calendar dates because they reflected actual local conditions. Activity coordination ensured that different preservation activities occurred in optimal sequence. Grain harvesting had to be timed to provide straw for other preservation activities. Animal slaughtering was scheduled to coincide with optimal weather conditions for meat preservation. Fermentation activities were timed to take advantage of optimal temperatures for different types of fermentation. Resource management coordinated labor and materials across the entire agricultural year. Communities had to plan when specialized equipment would be needed, when labor would be most intensive, and when different materials would be available. This coordination required sophisticated planning and community cooperation. Record keeping maintained knowledge of seasonal timing across multiple years. Medieval communities developed methods for recording optimal timing for different activities, noting variations caused by weather or other factors. This accumulated knowledge allowed communities to refine their timing and improve their success rates over time. Natural weather prediction for food security. Medieval communities developed sophisticated weather prediction systems that allowed them to anticipate conditions and adjust their food preservation strategies accordingly. Biological indicators used plant and animal behavior to predict weather changes. Changes in animal behavior, plant flowering patterns, and insect activity could indicate approaching weather fronts, seasonal changes, and long-term climate patterns. Experienced weather observers could predict conditions days or even weeks in advance using these natural indicators. Atmospheric observation included understanding cloud patterns, wind directions, and atmospheric pressure changes. Medieval people developed detailed knowledge of how different atmospheric conditions affected weather patterns and how these patterns influenced food preservation activities. Seasonal pattern recognition allowed communities to predict long-term weather trends and plan accordingly. Understanding multi-year climate cycles helped communities prepare for unusually severe winters, extended growing seasons, or other variations that affected food production and preservation needs. Integration with preservation planning meant that weather predictions directly influenced preservation strategies. Anticipated weather conditions determined when to harvest, how to schedule preservation activities, and what types of preservation methods would be most effective under expected conditions. The feast and fast cycle. Medieval communities developed sophisticated cycles of abundance and scarcity that managed food resources throughout the year, while maintaining community social structures and individual health. Preservation timing aligned intensive preservation activities with optimal conditions and resource availability. The autumn slaughter and preservation season was carefully orchestrated to make maximum use of available labor, optimal weather conditions, and peak animal condition. Different preservation activities were scheduled to use resources efficiently while avoiding conflicts between competing needs. Community coordination ensured that feast and fast cycles supported overall community food security rather than individual consumption preferences. Social and religious institutions often reinforced seasonal consumption patterns that optimized community-wide food security. Health management recognized that seasonal variations in food availability created different nutritional needs throughout the year. Communities developed understanding of how to maintain health during lean periods while taking advantage of abundant periods to build reserves and improve overall nutrition. Strategic breeding and life cycle management. Breeding timing coordinated animal reproduction with seasonal food availability and preservation schedules. Animals were often bred to give birth in spring, when food was becoming abundant and when weather conditions supported offspring survival. This timing also ensured that animals reached peak condition during autumn slaughter season. Life cycle coordination managed different animals through their productive life cycles to optimize food production while minimizing resource requirements. Young animals were managed for growth, mature animals for production, milk, eggs, wool, and older animals were scheduled for slaughter when they could no longer contribute to production. Feed management coordinated animal feeding with seasonal food availability and agricultural cycles. Animals were managed to take advantage of seasonal food sources like autumn mast, nuts and acorns, harvest residues, and spring pastures. This coordination minimized the need for stored animal feed while maximizing animal production. Community livestock management coordinated individual family animal management with community-wide strategies. Breeding programs, grazing management, and slaughter scheduling were often coordinated at the community level to optimize overall food production and resource utilization. Long-term weather and climate adaptation. Medieval communities developed strategies for adapting their food preservation systems to long-term climate variations and extreme weather events. Climate observation involved recognizing long-term patterns in weather and their effects on food production and preservation. Communities maintained knowledge of multi-year climate cycles and how these cycles affected food security strategies. Adaptation strategies modified preservation techniques based on anticipated climate conditions. Communities developed different preservation approaches for unusually wet years, drought years, or years with extreme temperature variations. These adaptations required flexible systems that could be modified based on conditions. Genetic diversity maintenance ensured that communities had access to crop and livestock varieties that could perform well under different climate conditions. Knowledge preservation maintained critical adaptation knowledge across generations. Communities developed systems for passing down knowledge about climate adaptation, ensuring that future generations would have access to strategies for dealing with climate variations and extreme events. The integrated wisdom of survival. After exploring these 50 techniques, what emerges isn't just a collection of interesting historical methods. It's a complete philosophy of resilience that fundamentally challenges how we think about food security, community cooperation, and sustainable living. Medieval peasants weren't just making do with primitive methods. They were sophisticated systems engineers who understood something we've largely forgotten, that true security comes not from accumulating resources, but from understanding processes. They didn't just store food, they created renewable systems for producing, processing, and preserving food that could function indefinitely without external inputs. The genius of their approach was integration. Every technique reinforced others, creating redundant systems where failure in one area didn't compromise the entire food security network. Root cellars worked with fermentation systems, which worked with community sharing networks, which worked with seasonal timing strategies. It was a web of interconnected knowledge that created resilience far beyond what any individual technique could provide. But perhaps most importantly, their systems were fundamentally sustainable and regenerative. A properly managed root cellar got better with age. Fermentation cultures improved over time. Community cooperation networks strengthened through use. These weren't just preservation methods, they were investments that paid dividends for generations. The scale of their achievement becomes clear when you consider that medieval Europe supported populations comparable to modern levels using only these techniques. Without refrigeration, without global supply chains, without chemical preservatives, they fed themselves so effectively that they had surplus energy for building cathedrals, developing arts and sciences, and supporting complex urban civilizations. Modern food systems, for all their technological sophistication, are fundamentally more fragile than medieval systems. We've traded resilience for efficiency, local knowledge for global supply chains, renewable systems for consumable inputs. The average modern city has about 3 days' worth of food in the supply pipeline. Medieval communities routinely maintained 6 months to a year of food reserves using nothing but local resources and accumulated knowledge. This isn't an argument for returning to medieval life. Modern technology offers genuine advantages in medicine, communication, and quality of life that we shouldn't abandon. But it is an argument for reclaiming medieval wisdom and integrating it with modern capabilities. The hybrid approach combines the best of both worlds: modern understanding of nutrition, sanitation, and chemistry with medieval understanding of systems integration, community cooperation, and sustainable resource management. Modern materials and tools can improve traditional techniques, while traditional knowledge provides backup systems that work when modern infrastructure fails. Consider what a modern household could achieve by combining these approaches. Solar dehydrators could improve traditional drying techniques. Modern understanding of fermentation chemistry could optimize traditional fermentation methods. Community-supported agriculture could recreate medieval agricultural cooperation using modern communication and transportation. Underground storage could use modern insulation and ventilation technologies to improve root cellar performance. The knowledge transfer challenge is significant. Medieval people learned these techniques over entire lifetimes within communities where the knowledge was practiced daily. Modern people need to compress this learning into shorter timeframes while maintaining the depth of understanding that makes the techniques work reliably. But the effort is worthwhile, because the knowledge itself is a form of wealth that can't be stolen, destroyed, or made obsolete. The person who understands fermentation chemistry doesn't need a functioning supply chain to preserve vegetables. The person who knows seasonal timing doesn't need weather forecasting services to plan food preservation activities. The person who can build community cooperation networks doesn't need government assistance during emergencies. The lessons extend far beyond food preservation. Medieval survival techniques teach systems thinking, community cooperation, seasonal planning, resource optimization, and long-term sustainability thinking that apply to many aspects of modern life. They provide frameworks for resilience that work at individual, family, and community levels. The environmental implications are equally important. Medieval preservation techniques were inherently sustainable, using renewable energy sources and creating no toxic waste products. Scaling up these techniques could significantly reduce the environmental impact of modern food systems while improving food security and nutrition. The social implications might be even more significant. Medieval food preservation was fundamentally communal, requiring cooperation, knowledge sharing, and mutual support that strengthened social bonds. Reviving these techniques could help rebuild the community connections that have been weakened by modern individualistic approaches to survival. But perhaps the most important lesson is about mindset. Medieval people understood that uncertainty was a permanent feature of life, and they developed strategies for thriving despite uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it. This acceptance of uncertainty led to more robust solutions that remained functional even when conditions changed dramatically. Modern life encourages us to believe that we can control or eliminate most risks through better planning, better technology, or better insurance. But the medieval approach acknowledges that some uncertainties are uncontrollable and focuses on developing adaptive capacity rather than trying to prevent all possible problems. This adaptive capacity, the ability to function effectively under changing and uncertain conditions, is probably the most valuable thing we can learn from medieval preservation techniques. It's not just about knowing how to preserve food. It's about developing the kind of flexible, resourceful, community-oriented thinking that can address whatever challenges emerge. The 50 techniques we've explored represent just the beginning of this knowledge base. Each technique opens doors to deeper understanding, broader applications, and more integrated systems. They're invitations to think differently about security, sustainability, and community cooperation. Your ancestors survived ice ages, plagues, famines, wars, and natural disasters using nothing but knowledge, cooperation, and deep understanding of natural systems. That knowledge is still available. Those skills can still be developed. That resilience can still be achieved. The question isn't whether this knowledge is relevant to modern life. The question is whether you're ready to begin reclaiming it. The seeds of medieval wisdom are waiting to be planted in modern minds. The harvest could be a more resilient, sustainable, and connected way of life that serves not just individual survival needs, but the broader goals of building communities and societies that can thrive under any conditions. Your journey into medieval wisdom. So here we are at the end of this deep dive into 50 medieval food preservation secrets. And I have to ask, which of these techniques absolutely blew your mind? Was it the sophisticated engineering of root cellars that maintain perfect temperatures without electricity? The complex chemistry of fermentation that transforms ordinary vegetables into preserved superfoods? The community cooperation networks that created food security for entire villages? More importantly, which technique speaks to your situation right now? If you have outdoor space, maybe you're thinking about that root cellar or those natural cooling systems. If you're in an apartment, maybe the fermentation techniques or the honey preservation methods seem more practical. If you're interested in building community resilience, maybe those cooperative storage systems and knowledge-sharing networks have caught your attention. But here's what I really want to know. What surprised you most about the sophistication of these medieval techniques? Did it change how you think about our ancestors? Did it make you question some assumptions about modern food security? Are there techniques from your own cultural background that use similar principles? Here's my challenge to you. Don't just consume this information, use it. Pick one technique that fits your situation and dive deep. Maybe start with something simple, like basic fermentation or herb drying. Maybe tackle something more ambitious like building a small root cellar or organizing a community preservation workshop. Medieval people didn't become preservation masters overnight. They learned through practice, failure, adjustment, and gradual improvement. The same process works today. The key is starting somewhere and building knowledge through actual experience rather than just theoretical study. Share your experiments, failures, and successes. The medieval approach was fundamentally about community knowledge sharing, and that aspect is just as important today as the technical techniques. When you learn something that works, teach others. When you encounter problems, ask for help. When you see others struggling with preservation challenges, share what you know. If you found value in this exploration of medieval preservation wisdom, help others discover it too. Share this with someone who might benefit from thinking differently about food security. Like this video if it changed how you think about self-reliance and community resilience. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the intersection between ancient wisdom and modern challenges. But most importantly, remember that the real wealth isn't in accumulating preservation supplies or building perfect storage systems. The real wealth is in developing the knowledge, skills, and community connections that can create food security under any conditions. Medieval people proved that humans can thrive in almost any circumstances when they have the right knowledge, the right mindset, and the right community relationships. That legacy is waiting for you to claim it. The techniques are just tools. The real treasure is the integrated thinking, the systems understanding, and the community cooperation skills that created these techniques in the first place. The future belongs to those who can bridge ancient wisdom with modern capabilities, who can think like their ancestors while living in the contemporary world, who can build resilience that serves not just individual survival, but the broader goal of creating sustainable, thriving communities. And as always, thank you for joining me on this journey into the remarkable world of medieval food preservation. The conversation doesn't end here, it begins here. The knowledge is waiting. The community is ready. The only question is, are you ready to begin? #50 Genius Medieval Food Preservation Secrets that kept peasants fed year-round